So I'm finally going to try and explain why I call kunigami and hiori plot devices, because how I use the word and how other people use the word is a little bit different. When I'm saying that kunigami or hiori are plot devices, I mean more so that they're characters that are specifically made to evolve or improve when Isagi's down. Or they're used to be tools for Isagi when he can't do something. I know you can make the argument for kind of a lot of characters that Isagi interacts with, but these two specifically seem directly tied to this. I did make somewhat of a timeline that you can follow. There is 2 pages of this, but I am going to go through it because it is a little bit confusing. So the first thing that I kind of need to establish is that because of Isagi's light novel, his ego's been sealed, so mentally, he doesn't need Hiyori until the 3rd selection. Because obviously we saw that thing when he was playing for his school's football team or whatever, and he was playing all for one or one for all. And we saw how that happened, right? He lost that game, Kira won that game. But we get more information in the light novel that tells us that Isagi always had Noel Noah as his favorite character. We already know that anyway. But the important thing to take away from that is that Isagi was listening to Noel Noah's advice of, I'd rather score 3 goals and lose 4-3 than help somebody and win 1-0. Isagi understood that even way back then. And for like the middle school-ish time, he was playing with that mentality in mind. It's only when he then goes over to high school that his ego is then sealed, because he's playing all for one or one for all, or whatever the fuck bullshit it is. So for the first 2 selections, because Isagi's unraveling that previously sealed ego, he doesn't need Hiyori for these 2, so that's why we don't see Hiyori. Then on the other side, even though he is kind of unraveling that ego, he's still not able to just whip out physical stats out of fucking nowhere. So, kind of jumping into the game, the first sort of feat that we see, actually there's one more before this one. So the whole reason why Isagi has to play in the dodgeball game is because Kunigami kicked the fucking ball at him. And it's that kind of little moment then that pushes Isagi to not kick the ball at Igagure and go for somebody stronger. So, even in the dodgeball game, you can kind of argue that Kunigami's a plot device. He's there to push the plot along. Because if Kunigami doesn't hit Isagi, then Isagi doesn't go through the awakening of challenging people that are stronger than him. But fast forwarding to this feat here, so Isagi's being pressured by Barrow, and like we said, he's unraveling that ego of his that's been sealed in the past. So he's able to kind of unlock sub-meta vision. I'm just going to call it that for now. The problem with this is that, yes, he's unraveling his ego, which is a good thing, but again, he's not just going to whip out a fucking goal formula out of nowhere. You can't evolve that quickly. So he does the next best thing, and he passes to Kunigami, a person who does have the stats. You can essentially think of Kunigami as a placeholder for where Isagi wanted to be and how he wanted to finish. There are kind of more feats that you can put in this not good at shooting, so pass to Kunigami. Because then you've got the next goal that Kunigami scores, I think, being against Team V. I think the first goal that Kunigami gets, Isagi or Bachara passes the ball to him, and then Isagi's screaming at him to shoot from that distance. Yeah, it's this one first. So Nagi has the ball, he then tries to shoot, it bounces off Igaguri's face, Bachara picks it up and then passes to Kunigami. Tangent? But just stay with me. The fact that Bachara's passing to Kunigami means that this was supposed to be Isagi shooting from here. But again, Kunigami's a placeholder. But if you do take what I just said into account, it then explains Isagi saying to Kunigami, you need to shoot from there! You're gonna be a superhero, right? And then Kunigami does that shit and fucking scores. The reason why I'm saying that this is a plot device feat is because Isagi needed Kunigami to shoot from here. Because, like, by the way, look how fucking far out this nigga is. This is at, like, the half fucking way line. Yeah, you can actually see where he's shooting from. It might even be from his own side. Yeah, because, wait, he's talking about 28 meters from the goal. Nigga, that's your semicircle from your box. Because look, halfway line is up there, then you have the other team's box just there. But the reason why I'm calling this a plot device feat is because if Kunigami didn't score here, then Team Z wouldn't have won this game. And they would have got eliminated. And I suppose you could make the same argument for like Bachara's goal or Chigiri's goal or Isagi's goal. But I would argue that those individuals scored off their own merit and it wasn't Isagi needing them to. Like Bachara's goal, for example. Bachara goes on a solo run. After saying to Isagi, what's wrong, are you scared? Chigiri then outplays Zantetsu by himself by kicking the ball further away. That's something that Chigiri figured out. Kunigami's goals this game directly come from Isagi's involvement. He's shouting at him here, shoot, you're gonna be a superhero, right? Chigiri did figure it out by himself, so the only person that scored because Isagi wanted them to was Kunigami. But we need to look at the other goal that Kunigami scores in this game. because it comes from Isagi's simulation. But basically, Bachira's got the ball, he passes to Chigiri, Chigiri gets pressured by Zantetsu. Chigiri then kicks the ball ahead because he's faster than Zantetsu, but he doesn't have the acceleration. Nagi goes to intercept the ball, Isagi intercepts Nagi's interception. He then passes the ball to Chigiri, so Chigiri doesn't have to slow down. Chigiri continues to run, shoots. It gets saved, and then Gagamaru gets the rebound. He shoots. It gets saved. The ball then falls to Kunigami, and Kunigami shoots and scores. As Isagi says, it's his territory. Just like my premonition. Alright, so it wasn't a simulation, but it's the same fucking thing, right? But that's 3 of Kunigami's goals all being scored because Isagi needed him to do that. Like I said, with the other characters on Team Z, they score off their own merit. Bachira's solo dribbling as soon as they're down 3-0 was Bachira's idea. Chigiri kicking the ball ahead of Zantetsu because he knows he's faster, just not acceleration. That was Chigiri's idea. Isagi's final goal in this game, I guess you could kind of say it's Bachira's idea, but it is Isagi's idea. It's Isagi wanting to score for his own merit. Comparing all of those goals to all of Kunigami's goals were scored because somebody else needed him to do that. Somebody else needed a hero. I promise you this wasn't intentional, but it just split them up, so I guess I'm posting them in different selections. But TLDR, I'm basically explaining why I'm calling kunigami and hiori plot devices. Go and check out part 1 for the context. But going over to the second selection, Isagi's starting to develop more as an individual. That's where he gains adaptability. That's where he gains off-the-ball movement. That's where he gets better vision. He gains adaptability and off-the-ball movements from Naruhaya. He gets better vision because he's challenging Rin, and Rin's talking about their eyes. And then this is where Kunigami comes into being a bit of a plot device. Kunigami is then in charge of marking Barrow when Isagi's playing against their team. So this is where we can kind of dive into the feat, right? Kunigami, for the entirety of this game, his job is to mark Barrow. And his job is to basically keep Barrow out of the shooting zone. And this results in Isagi seeing nothing but a dead end when he tries to make a pass towards Barrow. But then on the other side, if he makes a pass to Nagi, he sees how many possibilities there are. Which then results in Nagi scoring a goal and then Isagi exclusively playing with just these two. I'm just not gonna let him say the other part. But then that's when Isagi says, "Don't get in our way." Oh, I think canonically he says donkey, but I think it's way funnier to say that he said the other thing. So because Kunigami's stopping Barrow from reaching his goal zone, and Isagi doesn't see the point in passing to him, Barrow then awakens. And that's when we then get the chop dribble from him, and then he shoots and scores. But the reason why I'm specifically saying that this is Kunigami being a plot device is that Barrow is then the make or break for Isagi's team beating Rin. And I know that ultimately Isagi's team doesn't beat Rin, but if Barrow didn't have this specific awakening, they had no fucking chance. Because Isagi says kind of verbatim in that game after this one, oh, Barrow's playing so illogically that even Rin doesn't know what to do against him. But that illogicalness comes from this awakening. Instead of making the logical pass to Isagi or Nagi, he decides to keep the ball, the illogical move, and do a chop dribble instead, and then go and shoot and score his own goal. However, the foundation of this awakening was purely Kunigami, because if Barrow wasn't stopped from getting into the shooting zone, then the pass course to Barrow wouldn't seem like a dead end, because he can actually score. So then Isagi wouldn't go over to using Nagi, and Isagi also wouldn't then put more pressure on Barrow to evolve. So even though the driving factor for this evolution is the fact that Barrow doesn't want to pass or serve Isagi, but the foundation behind why he's in this environment in the first place is Kunigami not letting him get to his shooting zone. Because it's kind of a butterfly effect, right? Barrow can't get to his shooting zone because of Kunigami. Barrow can't score because of Kunigami. It then seems like a dead end to pass to Barrow because of Kunigami. But the funniest part is, we're still not done talking about how Kunigami's a plot device in the second selection, because how does Ryo survive again? Oh, Ryo survives because Kunigami wasn't seen as good enough, so the person who has objectively like the third best weapon in the entirety of this fucking verse is able to survive because Kunigami was the sacrificial lamb. Because the other thing that's really funny about Ryo making it in the second selection is that technically speaking, Kunigami was like a little bit better. Not that I think Kunigami was actually better than Ryo at football at that point in time, but Kunigami had a much better mental than Ryo did. And because Ryo's so mentally nerfed because of all the things he went through in the second selection, he's then at that point in time not actually able to bring out the best of his abilities. So in that game where it's Kunigami and Ryo versus Shido and Igagure, I'm not going to lie, it would technically make more sense for Shido to pick kunigami because kunigami's got a stronger mental than it would have been for Shido to pick somebody like Reo, a person who was still like low-key traumatized with all the shit that happened. I'm not being like wholeheartedly honest. I don't actually think that kunigami's better than Reo in the second selection. It's just that if you take into account the mental stability of each character, kunigami was like a little bit more mentally stable than Reo at that point in time. But then even to go back on the take that I just said, it does make sense for Shido to pick Reo over kunigami because Reo had more potential. Even though kunigami's technically better in that moment in time, because Reo's got more potential, Shido picks Reo because he saw that from kunigami's perspective, even though he is mentally stable, he's not really that good. Anyway, I guess the final point here is that kunigami was the sacrificial lamb so Reo could survive. And that is kind of the final piece of kunigami being a plot device until he comes back. So we can actually go over to the third selection now, and we can actually finally talk about Hiori. But the first thing I want to do is talk about the physical improvements that Isagi gets in the third selection, because this is kind of telling us that Isagi didn't need kunigami at this point until we get back into the NEL. Because Isagi, for one, has access to better geniuses because he's got access to the top 6. Not only that, he's got improved adaptability, his direct shot's a little bit better, so he doesn't need kunigami. Because all kunigami really did for Isagi was filling in the shooting part. But now Isagi's improved his adaptability and his shooting, he doesn't really need kunigami anymore. So that's why kunigami gets eliminated and we don't see him for a little while. But then going over to the Hiori side, in the third selection, Hiori gives so much information to Isagi that's so fucking important for him to score that final goal. Because at the start of this game that Isagi plays in the third selection, he's instantly marked by Karasu. And Karasu essentially just completely fucking nullifies Isagi's abilities. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about with Karasu, Hiori, and Isagi is that after Karasu scores his goal, or after Shido scores, or whoever the fuck scores, Hiori walks over to Isagi and says, yes, he's going to challenge you because he thinks you're the weakest link. But then he gives Isagi advice of not trying to cover his weaknesses, but instead challenge Karasu with his strong points. Because he says it in this panel here. The one thing I can say is give up on trying to hide your weak points and challenge him with your strong points. I feel like this is a very good mentality update for Isagi because Isagi probably would have been trying to hide his weak points around Karasu instead of challenging him with his strong points. No shit, right? Because let's say, for example, you're playing against somebody and that one person picks out all of your weak points. You are going to think that you need to cover or hide those weak points more than challenging that person that can already beat you. But what Hiori does is essentially tell Isagi, yes, he's going to challenge you on the stuff that you're weak at. But instead of trying to hide that, instead of giving up on trying to challenge Karasu back, you should instead challenge Karasu with the things that you're good at. Which is exactly what Isagi does. He's able to steal the ball away from Karasu while he's distracted with Rin. But unfortunately for Isagi, even though he is able to challenge Karasu, when he tries to score a goal, he's one step too short. So taking that and applying this back to our timeline over here, Isagi's body literally can't keep up with his mind. And although you would kind of say that this is a physical weakness, I want to say that it's a mental weakness. Because the problem behind Isagi not being able to keep up with his mind is that he's taking too long to think about it. Because just after he misses this, he says to Hiori, no, your pass was perfect. My reading of the field was perfect. I was just one step too short. Hiori, being a fucking genius, just then says, why don't you try thinking faster? And Isagi's like, oh my god, true. But the advice that Hiori gives to Isagi is the perfect advice because this is exactly what he was missing mentality-wise. Isagi was scanning the entire field and then slowly piecing together what was going to happen. But with Hiori's mentality update, he's scanning the field and running to a spot. So although you can make an argument that the reason why Isagi didn't score before was because his physical stats couldn't keep up with his mental, it's actually the opposite way around. He's taking too long to think. So that's why I'm kind of categorizing all the problems that Isagi has in this game as being mentality problems. Because for one, kunigami's fucking gone now. And for two, Hiori is the plot device that gives Isagi mental updates. And considering that Isagi was able to take that advice, internalize it, and then have an impact in the game from said advice like 2 seconds later, that tells you that all the problems that Isagi had in this game was more mental problems and not physical. Because if there was physical problems, he would have had to assist somebody else. I know he does technically assist in this game, but that was because it was like a requirement. It's not like Isagi was trying to score his own goal, knew that he couldn't, and then pass the ball. He was passing the ball to Shido because he wanted to have an impact and show his influence in that game. Anyway, continuing on with the mentality update that Hiori just gave Isagi, when Hiori then gets the ball towards the end of this game, Isagi then subconsciously activates Metavision. And with this new mentality update, he's actually able to break through Rin and Shido and score his own goal. And I know that this seems like kind of a dumb point to argue, but the only person that actually spoke to Isagi in this game really was Hiori. Nanase didn't really talk to him. He does help him, but he doesn't talk to him. Rin and Shido could not give less of a fuck about this guy. Well, Shido kind of does, but that's different. But the only person to actually help or give Isagi advice was Hiori. And the advice that Hiori gave to Isagi was the exact perfect things he needed to implement mentality-wise to have an impact in this game. You can also make kind of an argument that the fact that Hiori passed to Isagi was a bit of a plot moment, because if you think of it from Hiyori's perspective, why would Hiori take a risk passing to somebody who isn't one of the top 6 and then miss a shot when he could pass to one of the top 6 and get a guaranteed goal? But that's more of a take it or leave it type shit, because I do think it's fine that Hiori does pass to Isagi. Because what better way to show that you have an impact than letting one of the pawns score a goal from your assist? But that's like a... you can argue both sides type shit. I'm not gonna lie, it might be a good thing that these got split up by selections, because I just fucking realized I've been talking for 15 minutes already. But the main takeaway from the U20 game that I have is that Isagi in the first half doesn't really have any sort of impact in the game. Well, this was Isagi's first attempt on goal, and I'm like fairly certain he doesn't have another one in the first half. And the reason why this is kind of Hiori being a plot device, it's not really Hiori being a plot device. I think it's a testament to whenever Hiori or kunigami gets played, that's when Isagi then develops in the thing that that person's specializing in. For example, Isagi tries to use old goal formulas against the U20 team. Isagi only starts having close attempts to the goal when Hiori gets subbed on. And I know that you could make an argument that that's because Hiyori's passing the ball to Isagi and Hiyori's setting him up. But I again would kind of say that the takeaway here is that Isagi kind of had a mental update when Hiori got subbed on. Because Isagi goes from trying to use old goal formulas that get stopped way far out from the goal to then having attempts when he's this close. Or this one, for example. So I kind of want to say the reason why Kunigami's not involved in this arc and Hiori kind of has a bigger role is because Isagi needs to develop more mentally, not physically. Because if you think about what he was going to do when he got the ball in each one of those formulas, it was the exact same shot. The only problem that Isagi had is that he wasn't applying himself properly mentally. Because you can see as soon as Isagi starts to use himself as a tool to help Rin build the play up, that's when he then starts to get closer to the goal. Because he's developed mentally. Yes, he's helping Rin, but as soon as the ball goes to Bachara, they split off to try and get their own goals. I know that this doesn't really have any direct involvement with Hiori, but again, I just kind of want to make the connection that Isagi starts to mentally develop when Hiyori's around. Because physically, Isagi doesn't fucking change in the U20 game. He doesn't gain a new ability. He doesn't gain any sort of new weapons or anything like that. It's just his applications and his understandings of other characters, of luck, which ultimately results in Isagi scoring the final goal. The final goal wasn't scored because Isagi developed physically. The final goal was scored because Isagi's mentality updated. He went from repeating old formulas to then being a tool to Rin to then build up a play to then having other people pass the ball to him for it all to finally accumulate with Isagi believing that Rin's going to stop Sai and taking up a position where he can score from with his understanding of luck. All of that, all of those changes happen to Isagi mentally, not physically. He doesn't really gain any new weapons or abilities. And I think that's kind of a telltale sign that we don't see Kunigami, but Hiori gets subbed in. Because Isagi didn't need to develop anything physically. It's only what he knows and how he's applying it that needs to be changed for him to have an impact in this game. Which happens kind of just after Hiori gets subbed on. Because if I remember correctly, Isagi has that first attempt that Aiku blocks, and then we go over to the second half. But then in the second half, it's basically Shido scoring 2 goals, then Hiori gets subbed on, then Isagi has more of an impact. So I don't really think that that's a coincidence. You can think it's a coincidence. You can think I'm crazy right now. That's kind of your opinion. But I definitely think that there's a connection between how Isagi develops, whether it be physically or mentally, and who's around him to help that development. Like say, for example, if Isagi's on a team with Kunigami, you know he's going to improve physically more so than he is mentally. And if Isagi's on a team with Hiori, he's going to develop more mentally than he is physically. Which is a perfect segue over to the next part. Holy fucking shit, we're gonna get to the end of this video sometime today, I promise you. But finally going into the feats of what happens in the NEL, we kind of continue this whole hiori and kunigami being plot devices, because they get used in very similar ways to what we've just discussed. So in a more rational way, because I was very excited in my fucking TikTok, let me explain why kunigami and hiori get used in the same way in the NEL really quickly. If you think about the Bacha game being the first selection, it makes a lot of sense, right? In the first selection, Isagi didn't necessarily have the stats to be able to score, so he passes to Kunigami to fill that space. Because, by the way, if you even go and look at the goal that Kunigami scored first when he got a pass from Isagi, it looks awfully familiar. And obviously, this is because Kaneshiro has very limited angles and ways to make people shoot and score goals. But this, having the exact same angle as this shot, that feels kind of intentional. Or, I guess you could even say this one right here. If anything, that one matches better. Oh my god. So, yes, if we're thinking about the Bacha game, it is basically the exact same as the first selection. And while I could just leave it as the Kunigami comparisons, I think Kaiser's supposed to be Barrow in the first selection. Because in the first selection, Isagi awakens because Barrow's putting pressure on him. And that's when he passes to Kunigami to then score this goal. Kaiser is putting pressure on Isagi because he literally says, "Go fuck yourself, Kaiser." And Isagi decides to pass to Kunigami. So the first selection and the Bacha game are connected. They're basically the same fucking thing. So then going over to the Manshine game, the Manshine game is when Isagi starts to develop more as an individual player. And that is the exact same as the second selection. Because Isagi gains protagonism and metavision from this Manshine game. And what does he gain from the second selection? Off-the-ball movements and adaptability. And you could kind of say protagonism, but that's a bit more of a stretch. But to make more of a direct comparison of what Isagi gains in the Manshine game and what he gains in the second selection, although my argument for Isagi gaining protagonism in the second selection isn't as solid as my arguments for the other things, the very fact that Isagi looks towards Barrow and sees this dead path, and I also think the fact that he talks about knocking on the door of someone's heart and it not changing them, I'm pretty sure that's in this game, right? But either way, Isagi not using Barrow is because he's got some level of protagonism. He understands that Barrow is going to get the ball, keep the ball, and lose the ball. Would I really be insane for saying that is the exact same as Isagi gaining protagonism? I don't think it is really, because he does evolve kind of the exact same way in both of the games. But then moving over to the other thing that he gains in the Manshine game, which is kind of a direct copy of what happened in the second selection, Isagi gains metavision by following Kaiser and copying Kaiser. And what does Isagi do in the second selection to Naru higher? He copies him to gain off-the-ball movements. And while you can make an argument that Isagi has copied other people so it doesn't necessarily count, what are Isagi's two main weapons? Off-the-ball movements and metavision. And he gains both of them kind of at the exact same part in both separate arcs, if that makes sense. But another connection that the NEL has to the earlier stages of Blue Lock is that Kunigami's involved with Isagi's goals in these first two games. Kunigami's involved with Isagi's goals in the first two selections. Well, not directly in the second selection, but the very fact that he's used to save Reo, and the very fact that he's used to awaken Barrow, is kind of Kunigami being involved directly with Isagi's goals. Because, for example, if it wasn't for Kunigami kind of helping Isagi evolve Barrow, then they would have had no fucking chance against Rin's team. And if it wasn't for Kunigami helping Isagi against Kaiser, he wouldn't have got that goal. Holy fuck, it makes so much sense. But then you go over to the Ubers game, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated. In the Ubers game, Isagi gets his first goal in the NEL. And while that isn't necessarily the same thing as the third selection, the thing that is connecting both of them is that this is when Isagi's proving himself as a striker. Because in the second selection and in the first selection, it was more just tests to see if they could pass a certain level. But in the third selection, this is when Ego's now testing how good each player is as a striker or as a supporting character. So the very fact that Isagi gets a goal in the third selection and his first goal in the Ubers game, proving his existence on the pitch as a striker, isn't a fucking coincidence. You then also add into account that the reason why he scored his final goal in the Ubers game was because Hiori got subbed on and he thought faster, i.e. reflex x reflex. And if you go to the third selection, what's Hiori's advice there? Why not try thinking reflexively? Oh, it's almost like in the Ubers game, he then scores a reflex x reflex goal. Chronologically, in time with the third selection. Third selection, third game of the NEL. The same shit happens. Because what's even funnier about all of this is that Kunigami isn't really involved in this Ubers game. Just like how Kunigami isn't really involved with this. But Hiori is. And Hiyori's important in the Ubers game too. And Hiyori's telling him to think reflexively now. And he scores a reflex X reflex goal in the Ubers game. You cannot fucking convince me that I'm not seeing something here. Then the PXG game and the U20 game are the easiest ones to put connections to. This is when Isagi solidifies himself as the heart of Blue Lock, as the hero of Blue Lock, as whatever, right? The number one. Because by the end of the U20 game, everybody's glazing Isagi. Oh, Isagi, you're the one that scored the final goal. You're the hero of Japan. Sai's even like, oh, he's kind of interesting. Then he gets an interview on TV. You cannot fucking tell me all of that shit that happens at the end of the U20 game doesn't match with Isagi becoming the number one by the end of the PXG game. Because even the shit talking, bro, Isagi walks over to Kaiser to shit talk him. Sai walks over to Rin to shit talk him. I have either lost my mind or I am looking into Kanashiro's brain right now. I promise you on everything that I have, I guess, which isn't much. My pattern recognition doesn't lie. This is something. But to actually walk you through how their plot devices in the NEL, we first need to go to the Bacha game. And because the Bacha game does somewhat to a degree follow the plot points of the first selection, that's why Isagi relies on Kunigami to score the goal against Bacha. Because the funniest thing is, again, if you take this panel and if you take this panel, they're basically the same fucking thing. So I don't really need to elaborate on the Bacha game because it is the shortest game out of the NEL and it kind of just follows what happens in the first selection. It's just that now Isagi's at a higher level of play, he needs higher level shooting, and Kunigami has that because he was in the wild card. And actually, really quickly, just to go over Kunigami coming back, the very fact that Kunigami survived the wild card to then be turned into the perfect tool for Isagi to use when he doesn't have the stats to score does not feel like a fucking coincidence. It also plays into the same reason why I'm saying that Kanashiro is Ego. Because Ego essentially made Kunigami be the perfect tool for Isagi when Isagi's missing shooting stats. But at the exact same time, Kanashiro made Kunigami the perfect tool for Isagi when Isagi's missing shooting stats. So they're all more reasons why I'm saying that they're plot devices. But the mentality switch that Isagi has in this game, because he does also have mentality switches going through the games. I didn't necessarily mention this in my comparison video, but obviously Isagi slightly mentally updates in each one of these earlier games. Because in the Bacha game, he switches from trying to score his own goal to assisting Kunigami. That's because he's trying to challenge Kaiser in a way of creating his own path. But because Isagi did that automatically, Hiyori doesn't need to touch the field. Instead, Kunigami needs to be on the field so Isagi can pass to somebody else who can score. But then you go over to the Manshine game, right? And in the Manshine game, Isagi learns metavision, protagonism, but the problem he has is that his body can't keep up with his mind, and he needs to funnel out the noise. I know that sounds like kind of a lot, but his body not being able to keep up with his mind basically just comes down to the stamina issue that metavision takes. Because you see it when he leans over and he's like fucking exhausted, right? His body can't keep up with his mind yet. And I'm putting that under mental because... Why am I putting that under mental now that I think about it? Because funny enough, this is like the only time that the body can't keep up with the mind and it's actually the body's fault. Because this is a lesson that Isagi learns, funny enough, against the team that's focused on speed battles, physical dominance, stuff like that. So technically speaking, that body keeping up with mind should be over on that side. But what's staying on this side is learning metavision, learning protagonism, and funneling out the noise. The funneling out of noise is basically the advice that Noah gives to Isagi when he's trying to figure out what he wants to do. So they're all on the mental side. But on the physical side, while Isagi has improved because he's got metavision, protagonism, and he's funneling out noise, he's still not got the stats to score yet. So even when he does have an attempt, Kunigami's essentially got to help him a little bit so it actually goes in the net. But for this Manshine game, you've got to think of it like Isagi can do 95%. It's just that he needs that extra 5% of physical stats to get a goal out of it. If you then compare this to this, in the Bacha game, it was like a 50-50. Isagi had the idea to score, but had nowhere near the stats. While in this, Isagi's closer to having the stats, but he's not quite there. So that's why, again, Kunigami's kind of got to bail him out for this Manshine game. And it's also kind of why he passes to Yukimiya, but that's not really like a plot device thing. That just makes sense. But just like how in the first and the second selection, Kunigami was more pivotal to Isagi's growth, that's what happens in these first two games too. Because then by the time we go over to the Ubers game, Kunigami's not really involved with Isagi at all. Because at this point in time, Isagi's learnt the lefty shot. He's improved metavision so he can use it 100% and his body can keep up with his mind. So from the physical side, he's not missing anything anymore. He's got stamina, he's got better shooting, he's got better vision. So that's why kunigami isn't used whatsoever in the Ubers game, because Isagi's developed as an individual now. Now it's just proving himself to be a striker like he did in the third selection. So again, that's why kunigami doesn't really have any feats in the Ubers game. He's got that one little solo dribbling run, which was kind of shit now that you think about it. And he blocks Barrow's shot, which I would still technically say that that's a plot device thing, because I think Barrow would have scored there if it wasn't kunigami. So the very fact that kunigami blocks Barrow's shot, which would have made Ubers win, I think that's, again, playing into this whole plot device-ness. Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing that I'm calling these players plot devices, because I think it kind of low-key elevates their story. Because you've got a person who can't exist without somebody's expectations in Hiori, and then you've got a person who's fighting to be the hero of their own story in kunigami. So while I do call them plot devices, it's not from a negative connotation. I actually think it's kind of peak. But then, going over to the Hiori side for the Ubers game, Isagi essentially needs a clone of himself, or somebody who thinks the same, for him to actually play at his peak. That's why we kind of get this point when Hiyori's like, oh, but if I play, then we've got two Isagis on the pitch. Because Isagi now isn't lacking anything physically, he's lacking somebody who can understand his playstyle, or at least elevate his playstyle. So he's missing more of the mental aspects. That's why Hiyori comes in this point. But funny enough, just like how in the third selection, Isagi was told to think reflexively by Hiyori, now that Hiyori gets subbed on, Isagi scores a reflex x reflex goal with Hiyori. And last but not least, we've got the PXG game. And funny enough, this is when these two combine. This is when Isagi needs both of them at the exact same time to help him score his first goal. Kunigami needs to shut Shido down physically, because Isagi doesn't have the physical stats to score while Shido is free. Not only that, but Isagi also doesn't have the physical stats to shut Shido down, because Shido does have the potential to run away with this match. So because Isagi's lacking those physical stats to shut out Shido from this game, that's why kunigami has to do it. But it's not just that, it's because kunigami was also eliminated by Shido. Ironically enough, you can see how fucking full circle this whole plot device-ness and I'll fill in for you here and fill in for you there type shit is. Because then on the other side, he also needs Hiyori to help set him up. Because although I don't think Hiyori's feats in this game are too crazy, Hiyori is still like the second best midfielder on this team. So Isagi needs the physical stats from kunigami to shut Shido out of the game so he has a chance of scoring. And then he needs Hiyori's mental skill points to shut Charles out and to also help him score. But kunigami's doing the same thing as well. Which is really funny because when you think of these two, they're quite literally the brains and the brawn. So then to shut them down, you need the brains and the brawn. Because kunigami and Hiyori's job is to basically stabilize the field so Isagi can now control it. That's why they need the ultimate X ultimate fucking tri-flow chemical reaction or triple flow chemical reaction. Because these two need to balance out the field, which he as a whole used to do, if that makes sense. So just to pause for a second, think of it like this, right? Isagi is 100%. He's 50% physical stats, 50% mental stats. But Isagi needs another version of himself to stabilize the field so this version of himself can score. And that's where these two come in. Because they're both helping Isagi as he's developing, they're both also filling in 50% of each of the sides. Hiyori's 50% of mental stats going towards this fake version of Isagi. And kunigami's the other 50% of physical stats going into this fake version of Isagi. To then stabilize the field so this Isagi can score. I know that sounds really fucking confusing, but to explain it in an easier way, he needs a combination of Hiyori and kunigami, and he gets that when he teams up with Kaiser. Kaiser's got insane physical stats, we're not going to deny that, and he's also got insane mental stats, or vision, or whatever. So when I'm saying that Isagi needs another version of himself, and he's settled for these two combining into one, I'm basically trying to explain the Kaiser team-up before the Kaiser team-up, because this was his B-Tech version of Kaiser. Insane physical stats, insane vision. Insane vision. You know what? I shit talk Hiyori too much. Yeah, you've got insane vision. I'm just gonna give you that. Because for his first goal, he uses kunigami and Hiyori to score it. But for the final goal, because the level of play has increased, he needs a person that's got both of them combined into one, which is then Kaiser. But to finish this video off and then to kind of tie it back to the U20 game, in this game, at the end of this game, that's when Isagi solidifies that he's the heart of Blue Lock, the hero of Blue Lock, whatever the fuck you want to count it as. But with that, I think I've finally given all of the pieces of evidence that I wanted to give for why I call hiori and kunigami plot devices. Oh my god, wait, I need to do one more video explaining the conclusion. Right, and now finally, I want to give some context as to why I'm calling these two characters specifically plot devices. Because while it does sound like an insult to their characters, I actually personally think it elevates each one of their stories. For example, Hiori is really bad with dealing with other people's expectations. However, because he's a plot device to Isagi, he's got to kind of deal with those expectations. His first awakening comes from Isagi believing in him, to Isagi then shit-talking him at the end of the NEL, for Isagi to then have a downfall in the France game and Hiori be the one that scores. The reason why I think this is expectations and plot deviceness being put onto Hiori is because now Isagi's having a mental decline. That's literally what he's been representing. The mentality aspects of Isagi's evolutions. So now would be the perfect time for the character that represents the mentality plot deviceness of Isagi to score a goal when Isagi's having a mental decline. Isagi's mentally at his worst right now. And you think it's just a fucking coincidence that Hiori scored after everything I just said? No, it's not a coincidence. The very fact that Karasu has to rely on Hiori and Hiori bags this proves that Isagi is going to have a mental decline in this game and probably for the rest of this game. But all of this is connected because Isagi has expectations on Hiori. Hiori's awakening in the Ubers game was because of Isagi. Hiori's feats in the PXG game was because of Isagi. He then gets called slow at the end of the NEL or just leading towards the fucking World Cup. And that's why he then has a shot against Nigeria and it doesn't go in because Isagi's above where Hiori needs to fill in, if that makes any fucking inkling of sense. So because Isagi's riding that fucking high of being the number one now and running around being cocky as fuck, there is no need for Hiori to provide any mental assist to Isagi. So that's why Hiori performs his worst in the Nigeria game, because Isagi doesn't need help. But then you fast forward to the France game, and now that Isagi's scared being the number one, now Hiori scores. From a storytelling perspective, this goal was not bad. In universe, obviously for your own ego, it was a fucking horrible goal. But the story behind this goal is genuinely fucking peak. Because we've already explained the plot deviceness of Hiori's character in general, but it's not a bullshit thing because it's connected to the expectations of his backstory. So for him to score now, while the person who he's supposed to be the plot device for is at their mental lowest, is peak! And then finally with Kunigami's is kind of a lot more simple than Hiori's is. Kunigami has essentially got two paths ahead of him. He can be the hero for Isagi in Isagi's story, or he can be the hero for his own story. The whole thing about combat and being gluttonous is essentially him figuring out which path he's going to take. And the only way he can figure that out is by continuing to fight, by living in the fight. Because I don't think Kunigami needs any free time to think about what he wants out of this, because that's not going to give him an actual conclusion. The only thing that's going to give him an actual conclusion is being in fights to figure out what he's doing it for. Is he going to be the plot device for Isagi? Is he going to be the hero of his own? The very fact that he's got to figure that out and he's got that internal conflict in him now is genuine fucking peak. So, with all of that in mind, that is the reason why I call Kunigami and Hiori plot devices. It's not a bad thing, it's genuinely to elevate who they are as characters and what they represent. I finally think I'm done. Holy fuck, this was a yap. If you've made it this far, or even if you've watched all the individual TikToks, because I don't even know if I'm going to post these separately, I appreciate the love, I appreciate the support. Yeah, never stop updating your world's perspective. Drink water, look after yourself. Peace.